As any artistic medium expands its cultural reach, people will always find new ways to utilize that medium beyond the sake of entertainment, such as to spread a message or even challenge social and political ideologies. One of the most notable works in the field of video games to do this successfully was Metal Gear Solid 2: Sons of Liberty. Developed and published by Konami in November of 2001, Metal Gear Solid 2 was released for the PlayStation 2 just 1 week preceding the release of both Nintendo's GameCube and Microsoft's Xbox. As usual, this entry was designed and directed by series creator Hideo Kojima, whom Konami gave a team of over 100 people, 4 years, and a budget of $10 million to create his next vision. Kojima submitted his initial design for the game just a few months after Metal Gear Solid had been released for the original PlayStation. The earliest features he wanted in the next entry included the ability to hide bodies, more realistic AI that worked as squads and reacted to light and shadow, as well as more vertically interesting segments of gameplay. Konami also wanted to explore how digitization affects the military, everyday life, and even people's personalities. The game itself was also intended to leave the player unable to tell fact from fiction. In this pursuit, the team at Konami created what is now considered the first example of a postmodern video game, meaning one that takes a philosophical stance, usually deconstructive and ironic in nature, that focuses on the concept of reality as a mental construct, and how morality becomes ambiguous when viewed from multiple perspectives. So, as if it needs to be said, this is going to be a pretty heady video. The subjects tackled more explicitly within the game include artificial intelligence, political censorship, and synthetic media, aka fake news. Due to the success of its predecessor 3 years prior, as well as an extensive marketing campaign, Metal Gear Solid 2 became the most anticipated video game of 2001, selling 600,000 pre-orders in Japan and another 400,000 physical copies on release day. During its opening weekend in the US, the game sold over 500,000 copies, eventually totaling 1.8 million units throughout the month of November. Due to its later release in Europe, the region saw over 1.5 million pre-orders as the game continued to gain notoriety in North America and Japan. All in all, Metal Gear Solid 2 wound up as the highest-selling game in the series at over 7 million copies worldwide. An expanded edition of the game, known as Metal Gear Solid 2 Substance, was released in late 2002 for the PS2, Xbox, and Windows PCs. The most notable addition to this version, aside from minor regional tweaks, would be the addition of 500 bonus missions, set in either virtual reality or locations from the campaign. Since the original release, multiple ports have been remastered and re-released on later hardware, including the PS3, Xbox 360, and PS Vita as part of the Metal Gear Solid HD collection. Let's find out what made this game so historic and successful as we discuss what's so great about Metal Gear Solid 2: Sons of Liberty. Just as was the case with its predecessor, Metal Gear Solid 2 features a bit of reading material on its main menu to acclimate new audience members to the complicated narrative that the series is known for. And while these debriefings are just as optional as before, they've been expanded in this entry to an almost ridiculous degree. The first file presented to the player is a newspaper clipping that portrays the events of the previous Metal Gear title from the point of view of a journalist sharing how the events at Shadow Moses Island were initially covered up by the United States government until an expose was published that shook the public's faith in their government's account. This tell-all book was written by Nastasha Romanenko, the Ukrainian weapon analyst who served on Snake's advisory team in the previous adventure. As conveyed by this debriefing, Shadow Moses as a term is now equivalent to Roswell or the grassy knoll in terms of American conspiracies. The second piece of reading material is a manuscript accounting the events at Shadow Moses Island by some unseen journalist who claims to have witnessed the first game's events himself before disappearing after attempting to publish his perspective. This additional reading is almost 130 slides long, which, after completed, will actually reveal Nastasha's 324-page book on the Shadow Moses incident, should players be so inclined to read it. The inclusion of such elaborate debriefings and secondary points of view regarding the last game's events demonstrates a level of diligence and faith in building this game's universe that is usually reserved for novels or long-existing franchises found in media like movies or comics. Once the player feels like they're up to speed, the actual game begins with Solid Snake on New York's Washington Bridge, where he and his partner Otacon are working independently as part of an anti-Metal Gear fringe group, no longer in connection to the US military. Diving from the bridge, Snake boards a passing tanker to obtain photos of the new Metal Gear prototype, known as Metal Gear Ray, which has been secretly developed by the Marines and denied by the US government. But the ship is besieged by Russians alongside the returning villain Revolver Ocelot during the middle of Snake's mission. Eventually, Ocelot reveals himself and betrays the rest of the Russians in a ploy to steal the new Metal Gear Ray, and we learn he's being partially controlled by the newly attached arm of Liquid Snake, though Ocelot mentions he himself is in league with someone he refers to as Mr. President. As this game's extensive prologue comes to a close, we see the destructive power of this amphibious nuclear weapon as it splits the tanker in two, framing Snake for this attack against the Marines as he's left drifting in the Hudson River. After the tanker mission, we jump ahead 2 years, listening to the familiar voice of Colonel Campbell as he briefs a different Agent Snake on a mission at an offshore decontamination plant known as the Big Shell. The facility has been taken over by a terrorist group known as the Sons of Liberty, being led by someone using the name Solid Snake, though Campbell informs our protagonist that the actual Solid Snake died on the tanker 2 years prior. To avoid complicating transmissions, our new Agent Snake is quickly redesignated as Raiden. The use of a new character as our hero gives enough reason for the repetition of ideas that players of the last game would have known already, but new players would need to pick up on quickly for the sake of understanding the game's mechanics and lore. In order to keep Raiden's presence in the game a secret prior to release, preview trailers actually showed Snake in situations that wouldn't feature him in the final game. This big reveal only really impacted North American audiences, where the game was released slightly earlier than Japan and Europe. We learn that Raiden's real name is Jack, and that the intelligence analyst on his team is Jack's romantic interest, Rose. Raiden's young, handsome design, as well as the love story between the topically named Jack and Rose, was meant to appeal to female audiences. Though Solid Snake was a perfectly capable operative in the last game, and even received a cool somersault animation during the tanker segment, Raiden is shown to be much more agile and acrobatic, performing an aerial cartwheel instead. He also has an impressive roundhouse kick when fighting up close. Aside from just looking good, Raiden's acrobatic stunts also allow him to traverse obstacles that Solid Snake had never been able to. For instance, the player can now leap over the edges of railings to hang from them, as a new method of sneaking around enemy guards when moving between sections of the Big Shell. Other advancements to the player's maneuverability include the ability to jump across certain gaps, climb chest-high objects, and even swim during certain segments of the game. Soon after beginning his mission, Raiden crosses paths with a wounded soldier who introduces himself as Iroquois Pliskin. Though he won't elaborate much further on his role at Big Shell, Raiden trusts him enough to work with this Lieutenant Pliskin to defuse a series of bombs that threaten to sink the entire facility, as well as defeat the specialized enemy forces known as Dead Cell, who we'll circle back on later. From that point forward, part of the player's experience is to know they're being lied to about Solid Snake's involvement in the tanker incident. What we don't know as audience members is who's actually aware of the truth behind these events, who's just going along with what they've heard, and who is actively hiding information from us. Even Rose and Raiden are hiding something from each other from the start of the game, with Rose's secret about the importance of a certain date, and Raiden's reluctance towards opening up to her. A significant portion of this game's remarkable experience is generated as the player tries to figure out why they themselves, and not just our protagonist, are having information withheld from them. Raiden, however, as the player's avatar, is suspicious as to the legendary Solid Snake's true fate, so he sends Rose out to dig up any information she can on Snake's life after the Shadow Moses incident. Just as in its predecessor, every antagonist in this game is highly personified with their own dark takes on morality and mortality, thanks to their uniquely complex personalities and backstories. After discovering a bloody hallway that's very reminiscent of a scene witnessed in the previous Metal Gear Solid, players come face to face with the gracefully brutal Vamp, the first of our antagonists in the aforementioned Dead Cell unit. The next major player that we meet is the tragically powerful Fortune, who fires a unique electromagnetic railgun and deflects bullets as they approach her. The battle with Fat Man, Dead Cell's rollerblading demolition expert, actually feels cleverly inspired by the classic Hudson Soft Maze game Bomberman, which features players setting and avoiding bombs in hallways to defeat foes while avoiding blowing up. In Sons of Liberty, Raiden has to chase Fat Man between shipping containers while the enemy sets timed explosives that our hero must defuse while dodging enemy fire. However, to counter Fat Man's speed thanks to his rollerblades, the player can set their own bombs in the form of claymores in order to stall and weaken him. The developers even managed to outdo the impressive helicopter fight from the last game with an exciting confrontation with a Harrier jet. To make the situation more complicated, the player also has to avoid locking on to a friendly chopper. Meanwhile, the speed of both the jet and the player's means of tracking it in first person demonstrated how much more advanced Sons of Liberty was thanks to the power of the PlayStation 2. The game's first-person gunplay is more realistic and responsive than most first-person shooters could boast in 2001. Weapons aside from those with scopes can now be aimed and fired from first-person view, which is a fantastic addition to the Metal Gear series because the first weapon the player gets their hands on is a tranquilizer pistol, which knocks out targets for different amounts of time depending on where they're hit. A tranquilizer dart to the head, for instance, will render an enemy unconscious immediately and have a much longer lasting effect than if they were hit in the arm. You can also see how much longer an enemy is expected to be out cold by the number of Z's or stars that float above their head. On top of the added accuracy, firing from first person also allows players to knock out searchlights or destroy an enemy's radio by shooting at it while it's still on their hip or even in their hand. Sometimes after a firefight, the player will continue to lose health from blood loss, which has to be patched with a bandage, otherwise the player will bleed out while leaving a trail for their pursuers. This serves as another reason to avoid direct firefights, especially because bandages are hard to come by. Luckily, there are far more non-lethal means of incapacitating your enemies in this game, allowing players to get through the game without killing anyone other than primary antagonists for a guilt-free experience and/or bonus challenge that makes the player feel a little more stealthy and a little less like a one-man army. If the player is unarmed, they can now move dead or unconscious bodies out of sight, like in Thief: The Dark Project or Hitman Codename 47. Moving these bodies out of the way will keep other guards from becoming suspicious if the reawakened enemy remembers how they were knocked out. The player will frequently find opportunities to not only hide incapacitated foes within lockers, but hide themselves in a locker when cornered by patrolling guards. While hiding in a locker, players can see through the slats at the top, but they can't access their radar to know exactly where enemies are. To make things more interesting and still provide players with a way of understanding their surroundings, Snake's heartbeat will increase in volume and frequency the closer an enemy is, fading as they walk away, and the controller will vibrate accordingly as well. As a first for the franchise, the character portraits during codec communications are now fully rendered busts of each character as they talk, rather than stylized images. In fact, all of the character models in this entry are much more highly detailed on the PS2, no longer being limited to a handful of polygons for their face and uniform. Character animations during cutscenes, as well as on the codec communicator, also feature lip syncing, eye movement, and blinking, which is a big step up from the head bobbing seen in 1998. Sometimes while characters are talking over the codec, the frequency monitor will now present relevant footage, both in-game clips as well as full motion video. By pressing the start button, players can now view a map of the entire structure for a better understanding of their position in the game's world. However, before they can access a map of that section of the facility, they'll need to activate a computer node, often tucked away in some corner of the immediate area and behind enemy forces. Not having a map for each immediate area forces players to express a little caution and forethought while navigating a new environment in which they don't know the possible threats yet. The bomb defusal mission early on gives the player a reason to visit every section on the accessible half of the big shell in order to collect all of the map data for these areas, as well as for smoother navigation as objectives become more difficult and time sensitive. In an update to the security measures of enemy forces, the player can no longer be expected to relax freely in an area where they've rendered the guards unconscious, because their commander will eventually radio in asking for their status report. After receiving no response, headquarters will send reinforcements to check out the area and wake up the guards. However, as long as the player was unseen, the security level won't go up. More highly skilled enemies will call for reinforcements much faster and more calmly than grunt soldiers, giving the player less time to react should they be spotted. Metal Gear Solid 2 gives players their first chance in the series to put on an enemy disguise and go undercover, if even for a brief period, which really felt like a missing piece in the previous game's stealth action experience. There's also a well-structured escort mission in the second half of the game that requires the player to not only sneak their escortee past patrolling guards, but also through water and by covering her with sniper fire, quickly combining elements of the previous game that hardly had a chance to be explored, while also keeping the often dreaded trope of escort missions from becoming too boring or cumbersome. Rather than Konami's in-house team of musicians and composers, Kojima deliberately selected prolific film composer Gregson-Williams to create the game's soundtrack. His orchestral cutscene underscoring and electronically sampled beats would become a staple of the Metal Gear Solid experience, with Gregson-Williams contributing to every numbered entry in the series from the second game onward. Much of this game's music features some of the same layered orchestrations that could be expected from a film score, with additional digital noises and synthetic beats to create a semi-futuristic atmosphere felt in the soundtracks of turn-of-the-millennium movies like The Matrix. Many pieces in the soundtrack feature heavy use of reverb and echoes to create a sense of isolation in an environment that feels both mechanical and cavernous. The quieter moments in the soundtrack often rely on soft digital percussion to create an industrial sound that keeps the player from ever completely relaxing. Even if the player has given away their presence, the music doesn't necessarily become stressful or panicked, but the increased beats per minute give the player a sense of urgency. The use of soft, quick beats gives a sense of a countdown, which is especially appropriate in the situations where the player is waiting out the enemy's suspicions. The music that undertones more delicate moments between Jack and Rose forego the heavy instrumentation of the rest of the soundtrack for a soft piano solo that starkly contrasts virtually every other piece. All in all, the soundtrack of Sons of Liberty personifies the concepts of stealth and espionage as heavily as the gameplay does, and as heavily as any other piece of media has ever presented. To be honest with you all, I was initially scared to analyze Metal Gear Solid 2 because, while it has never been a favorite of mine, it was actually one of the games that inspired the creation of this channel. Several years ago, when I was first playing through the Metal Gear Solid series, I had reached the second entry after loving its predecessor. However, something just didn't click for me, and I couldn't find myself enjoying the game at all. I didn't like playing as someone other than Snake, the story felt overwhelming, and I got tired of being dragged back and forth between the segments of the big shell. So, a few hours into the game, and not enjoying myself, I went online to ask members of the Metal Gear Solid community something along the lines of, "Hey, what's so great about this game, because I'm just not seeing it?" And as can be expected by approaching most any fanbase on the internet, I was promptly tarred and feathered with responses like, "You have to beat it to understand," which is a horrible way to consume any media, dragging yourself through something you don't enjoy or understand just for the hope of a payoff once it all makes sense. So, as I finish this episode, I'll try to sum up this game how I wish someone might have explained it to me, even without having to explain the ending or dumb down the complex narrative. Just like its predecessor, Metal Gear Solid 2 is one of the most dramatic, mature, and intricately written video games to exist at this point in the medium's history, and the concepts explored throughout the game have only become more prophetic and relevant with time. Upon release, Sons of Liberty received universal praise and nearly perfect scores from the world of gaming journalism. Some of the only critiques to be found, which have gone on to be large topics of discussion in the Metal Gear community, would have to be the long-winded dialogue whenever the game really tries to chug along to the next plot point, as well as the surprise switch away from playing as the fan-favorite Solid Snake. And though it's buried deep into complex Metal Gear lore, which can't be revealed in this video, there is a good reason for why the player controls Raiden of all people instead of Solid Snake, as had been the case in all previous entries. Otherwise, the graphics, sound design, improved gameplay, and philosophical undertones within this video game have garnered substantial acclaim and led Metal Gear Solid 2 towards a place in gaming history as the highest rated and most successful PS2 exclusive, and the console's defining killer app which jettisoned Sony into the lead of the console wars. Sons of Liberty features a highly honored trait in the world of video games, being that some of the greatest aspects of this game's experience can simply not be explained from one person to another. They have to be experienced by the person actually playing the game. The player has to choose what to believe and not believe through both the story and their understanding of the gameplay mechanics. Even if every beat of the story were dissected in this video for those who don't care about spoilers, it still wouldn't have nearly the same impact as someone who had to learn how everything works by being a part of it. Any narrative can feature twists and turns that keep the audience engaged and excited, but it takes a certain quality in any work of art to force its onlookers to think and feel, rather than just enjoy. That is what's so great about Metal Gear Solid 2: Sons of Liberty. Thank you all for joining us on this episode of What's So Great About Gaming, as we took a look behind the curtain in Metal Gear Solid 2. If you want to support the channel, make sure to like, subscribe, ring the bell, and do whatever else the algorithm demands of us to keep up with our favorite content. Also, consider being a part of the community on Discord, Twitch, or Patreon. If you want to hear what's great about another game, check out the link to our last episode, Grand Theft Auto 3, on screen or in the description, and let us know your thoughts on Sons of Liberty and what games you'd like to see in the future. Thanks again for watching. Now go play a great game. We'll see you next time.